what's the most satisfying thing to do on the guitar? Well, a beginner might say something like this. Just learning a riff like Smoke on the Water or maybe Seven Nation Army. However, as an early kind of intermediate player, you have a different idea of what is satisfying on the guitar. And that's probably most likely just noodling around with your pentatonic scales and exploring how to solo for the first time. And then you kind of get to the hard stuck intermediate stage, where you kind of stay at intermediate and you don't really progress anymore. And the person that's at this stage of their guitar playing might say that buying gear instead of learning new techniques is the most satisfying thing you can do with your instrument. And then you get to the point where you've unlocked everything and you're a guitar god. And when you're a guitar god, everything is satisfying to play on the instrument. Well, what if there's something in common that every guitar player finds satisfying, no matter what skill level you're at on the instrument? I think everyone can agree that writing your own inspiring music is extremely satisfying. So what can we do to make our own creations sound more inspiring and less dull? I think a lot of us start playing and start creating music only to be frustrated that we actually have no idea what we're doing and we don't know how to make something sound musical. So, today we're going to go over how we can get the most out of our diatonic chords in a key. And then once we learn that, how we can start breaking the rules of the diatonic harmony and start borrowing chords from different keys. And also, how to actually understand how the circle of fourths and fifths works without having to learn or memorize this weird looking diagram. If you don't know who I am, I help intermediates become more advanced players. Now, if you're looking to progress your playing as fast as possible, I recommend you check out the free school community I've created for like-minded guitarists who are trying to progress their playing. There's a link to join in the description. Now again, people that join also get access to my private one-on-one lessons if they're interested. So if that sounds like it's something up your alley, again, there's a link in the description. You might as well check it out. So to follow along with this video, we're going to need to know what diatonic harmony is. And once we understand this, we can start thinking about how to break the rules of diatonic harmony and get more interesting chord progressions and evolve out of just the 7 chords we have in one key. So we need to know a bit about the major scale. Obviously we can play it across one string like this, but we also need to know that the chords inside of our key, they come from the major scale, and we can turn each note into a chord in the major scale. And we need to know how to predict and the formula behind which chord is going to be what and in what sequence they come by with the major scale. If you've never done this before, don't worry, it's not too difficult to understand. So again, we have 7 notes inside of our major scale, which means if we can turn each of those notes into chords, we have 7 chords. Now, 3 of these chords are going to be major, 3 of them are going to be minor, and the odd one out is going to be diminished. So let's look at the formula to tell which order our major and minor chords come by in the diatonic major scale. So to do this, we want to look at just playing the major scale across one string. Now what we're going to do is we're going to assign a number to each point we play on the scale. Each unique individual note that we play in the scale, we're going to put a number on top of it. So our starting point, which is C, we're going to call that number 1, right? And then D is number 2, E is number 3, and I think you're following the formula that I'm coming across here now. So F is going to be number 4, you know that G is going to be 5, A is going to be 6, B is going to be 7, and then C is back to 1 again. Right? So we've numbered each point that comes along in the major scale. Now, we're going to figure out the formula using those points to tell which order the major and minor chords come by, right? So point 1, 3, and 4 are always going to be major. So if we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, those are always going to be major. So in any major scale you play, point 1, 3, and 5, or 1, 4, and 5, my bad, point 1, 4, and 5 are always going to be major chords. Now, that's our 3 major chords covered. What about the minor and diminished chords? Well, point 2, 3, and 6 are always going to be your minor chords. So again, if you go to your starting point, you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's how you find all your minor chords. And then again, the diminished one, the odd one out, is always going to be point 7. So in any key, any major key, the 7th point is always going to be your diminished chord. The 1st, 4th, and 5th point of the major scale are always going to be your major chords, and then your 2nd, 3rd, and 6th point are always going to be your minor chords. So that gives you the formula to kind of find the order of major and minor chords inside your major scale. So just to quickly recap that, we have 1, which is major, 2, which is minor, 3 is going to be minor, 4 is going to be major, 5 is going to be major, 6 is going to be minor, 7 is going to be diminished, and then we go back to 1, again up an octave. And again, we don't have to be limited by playing these bar chord shapes as well. If you know how to build chords from any root notes, you could play the chords in your key in any way you want. So for example, if I use the root notes, I can play all the chords in C major using the open chords. So I could go like 1 chord C major, the 2 chords D minor, 3 chord is E minor, the 4 chords F major, 5 chords G major, the 6th chord is A minor, and then like B diminishes the 7th chord, and then back to C again. So you can use any type of chord you want to play through these progressions. You don't have to just follow up and down using these bar chord shapes. So let's make sure that we know how to make the most out of just these 7 chords in one key first, before branching out and trying to take and steal chords that aren't inside our key and borrowing from other key signatures. So we need to understand that each of these 7 chords, they serve a specific purpose. Some chords are going to push your ear in a certain direction. Other chords are going to pull your ear in a different direction, right? Some chords create a sense of just a slight bit of tension. Some chords create a sense of nice, like home sense of resolution. And then some chords create a large amount of tension that are kind of begging your ear to kind of move to resolve them back to home. The way you want to think about how these 7 chords work is the same way that, like, if you've played a video game before and you've played a game that has characters that are in certain types of classes, the chords work the same way. So you can imagine that in a game you might have like the tank class, or like the support or healer class, and maybe like an offensive based class or something like that. The chords inside a single key signature kind of work the same way. So we have 3 classes of chords inside a diatonic key signature that pull us in certain directions and function in certain ways. So let's look at what those 3 classes are. So again, your diatonic chords, they're in classes. We have 3 classes. They're also known as chord families. So I'm going to like switch between the name classes and chord family. We refer to them the exact same way. So we have the tonic class, or you can call it a chord family. We have the subdominant class, or again, you can call that a chord family. And the dominant class, again, you could call that a chord family instead of class if you want. So our 1, our 3 chord, and our 6 chord in a key belong to the tonic class. The 2, the 4 chord, they belong to the subdominant class. And then our 5 and 7 chord, they belong to the dominant class. Now, let's look at the function that each class serves, the role they play in terms of how they relate to other chords. So, the tonic class, it serves as a neutral resting point in your chord progression. When we play a tonic chord, it feels like we're at home. There's not a lot of tension going on. Like the chord progression is at ease, right? And then when we play the chords in the subdominant class, it sounds like we're kind of moving away from somewhere. There isn't a huge amount of tension, but there is a sense of direction that we're moving somewhere else. We're moving away from our home center. Now, the dominant classes, these create a lot of tension, and they desperately want to be resolved back to a tonic chord. So if you listen to we have our dominant chords, right? We have the 5 and the 7 chord in our key. These are part of our dominant class. Let's listen to how they kind of resolve back to a tonic chord. So I could play 5 and then go to a different tonic chord like 6. It kind of resolves quite nicely, 5 to 6. Or I could go to 5 to like 3, for example. Or maybe like 5 to 1. That sounds quite like a neutral resting point. It desperately wants to move somewhere. The same again for that 7 chord, which is going to be the diminished chord in your progression. You can hear that's quite tense and uncomfortable, and it wants to move somewhere. So it moves very nicely and resolves nicely to a tonic chord. So again, let's go like 7 to 1. Again, you can hear there's all that tension has been released once we move to the new chord. And again, let's try a different tonic chord. 7 to 6. Again, it sounds quite like restful there, like we're back at home. All that tension kind of dissipates when we move from a dominant chord to a tonic chord. So using this, we can find ways to create progressions that kind of flow and move quite naturally from different chords and then get resolved quite nicely back home. So, for example, let's start on a subdominant chord, then move to a dominant, and then resolve it back to a tonic. So the most common example of this is used all throughout jazz music. You might have heard this before. It's called a 2-5-1 progression. So that's a great example of 2 being a subdominant, 5 being a dominant, which has a bit of tension, and then 1 being the tonic, which kind of resolves nicely back home. You can hear how they kind of flow into each other quite nicely. Now we can do the exact same thing again by exchanging these different chords out for different chords in the exact same class. So if we know that the 4 chord is also a subdominant, the 7 chord is also a dominant chord, and the 6 chord is also a tonic, we can get the exact same kind of like flowing movement between those 3 chords using completely different chords instead of 2-5-1. So we can go 4-7-6, and that would sound something like this. So we go like 4, we can go 7, and then we can go 6. Now, we can use both of those to inspire a more kind of elaborate, lengthy chord progression that flows quite nicely. So if we add like both of those things together, where we go subdominant into dominant into a tonic, and then a different subdominant into a different dominant into a different tonic, we've got like 6 chords to kind of flow between now. So let's hear what that sounds like when we add all of those together. So we go 2, 5, 1, and then we go to 4, 4, 7, 6, and you can imagine that could keep looping round. Right? So when we start thinking about these chords in terms of the class they come from and how each class functions and relates to other chords inside of its diatonic key center, it becomes a lot simpler to come up with chord progressions that have a kind of flowing sense of direction. Now, we can do a lot with working with just the 7 chords inside of our key signature when we take those chord families into account. But what can we do to spice things up a bit more to make our chord progressions sound more unpredictable and intriguing? We can do this when we start thinking about borrowing chords. Now, to borrow chords from different keys, we're going to have to start thinking about the cycle of fourths and the cycle of fifths. Now, I know that when I mention the cycle of fourths and the cycle of fifths, you probably think about this kind of weird looking diagram that looks like some ancient rune from some long unearthed society from thousands of years ago. It's like hard to read and understand. You probably get quite confused and intimidated by looking at it. Well, I just want you to forget all about the diagram of the circle of fourths and fifths. We're not really going to think about the diagram at all. You don't have to memorize this weird kind of looking image. Like, we're just going to learn how to use and move around in fourths on the instrument. So we're going to find an actual useful way to apply this to the guitar rather than just kind of trying to memorize some weird diagram. So the point of the cycle of fourths and fifths is it shows you how to move chords and key signatures in intervals. So the same way that you can take a note, then move that note up a fourth, and then move that same note up a fourth, and then move that new note up a fourth again, and move that up a fourth, and move that up a fourth again and again and again. You can do the same thing with chords. And like instead of going up, like you could go backwards. So I could go like here, and then backwards a fourth, and then backwards a fourth. And you can kind of keep revolving around chords that way. Now, I want to show you an example of where this is already used in music. You're probably aware of the song Hey Joe by Jimi Hendrix. So it kind of used the same idea where we move chords around in intervals. So at the start of the song, we do this kind of cool lick on over that E major chord. But the rest of the chords, they don't really follow a key signature. They're kind of moving around in interval gaps. So we go from like C major, and then we go down the interval of a fourth, and form a new major chord from that root note. So we go C to G. And then from G, we move that root note up a fifth and create a chord from there, which gives us D major. And then we go down a fourth to A major, which gives us this kind of interesting sounding chord progression. This movement over here is all done using the circle of fourths and fifths. And you can imagine that you can keep repeating this if you know how that works. You can keep moving things down in fourths and up in fifths to kind of go all over the fretboard. So I could kind of expand that chord progression. Or I could go like... You can kind of keep expanding upon this and evolving it by just moving down a fourth, and then when you're on the lowest string, move it up to the fifth, and then down, and then up the fifth. It's kind of like just this movement. That's what the bass notes are doing when we look at how each chord is formed. So you can imagine doing this for chords inside of a key signature as well. So if we go back to like the diatonic chords of C major, we have like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We can go like down a fourth and borrow the chords from a different key if we're playing the chords here on the fifth string. So we could borrow the chords from G major by doing this. So we play like the 1 chord of C major, then go down a fourth to the 1 chord of G major, and then go to the 2 chord of C major, down a fourth to the 2 chord of G major, go to the 3 chord of C major, and down a fourth, and you get the 3 chord of G major, and then go to the 4 chord of C major, and down a fourth, you get the 4 chord of G major. Again, same thing for the 5th chord of C major, down to the 4th, and you get the 5 chord of G major. So you can kind of find chords to borrow from other keys by doing that. But just going like down a fourth, if you have your chord here, and then if you have your chord from the root note on the low E, just move it to the 5th there. So you can imagine like doing stuff like that. You can kind of find ways to move and borrow chords by moving them around using fourths and fifths. And again, you don't have to learn and memorize some weird diagram to do this. You just got to know that like chords move around in intervals, and probably the nicest sounding chords to borrow from other keys are from the keys that are a fourth below or the fifth above the one you're currently playing. So we can use this idea to create something called a turnaround. Now, I'm sure we've all heard of the word turnaround before in music. You might be familiar with like blues turnarounds when we play something that sounds like... Right, we're all quite familiar with that on the guitar. But we can actually do more than just blues turnarounds, right? The goal of a turnaround is to take us from the end of our chord progression and then just kind of shove some fancy chords in between to get us back to the start again. Instead of what we're playing in a blues there, instead of going from like the 5 chord straight into the 1, we're doing this kind of cool like a nice little kind of filler to make it sound more interesting. So yeah, the goal of a turnaround is to find a more interesting way to take us from the end of the progression back to the beginning again. So let's say I have a 1, 2, 6, 5 chord progression in the key of A major. So that would be like A major, B minor, F sharp minor, and then I have, what's this, E major. So I can fit a turnaround between that E major back to the A major. So instead of going like I can find like some extra chords to fit in over here using that circle of fourths and fifths idea. So the way we want to do this, we want to look at the chord we're going to be returning to. So this is the bit at the end of the turnaround that we go back into. From here, look at the chord we have of fourth underneath. So this kind of like this D major chord, we can use that around an A major chord. And then if we go like a fifth backwards from that D major, we get a G major. So if we pair both of those together, it leads us quite nicely back to that A major. So if I fitted those in between at the end of the 5 chord, I get a nice little transition that takes us back into the start of our chord progression. It's called a turnaround. So yeah, let's listen to what that sounds like when I add this kind of circle of fourths and fifths idea into the chord progression. So it would sound something like this. You can hear it sounds a lot more interesting and intriguing when we add those kind of extra chords to take us back to the start of our chord progression. So we have a lot more room to add these extra chords into a progression, again using like the 4th and the 5th from either above or below the current chord you're on, when we have more simple chord progressions. So we've all heard songs before with just like 2 chords that kind of loop around. So let's see how we can transform a 2 chord progression using these kind of circle of 4th and 5th tricks to add in those extra chords around. So let's say we have a 1 to 6 in A major. So that's the 1 chord, A major. And then we have F sharp minor, which is the 6th chord. So we can add chords a 4th or 5th away to approach each chord. So instead of just going like A major to F sharp minor, we go A major, and then let's go like a 5th below F sharp minor. So we go A major, minor chord a 5th below, and then to the F sharp minor, and then coming back we go major chord a 4th below, and then back to A major. So if I add those together, instead of just going, I can go sounds so much more interesting when I add those chords in. Now again, we can level this up even more by starting to approach the new chords that we've added in from a 4th or a 5th below. So we have A major, then we have like a 5th below the F sharp minor with this minor chord here. What if we go a 4th below and add a minor chord there? So we could go like A major, do a kind of like little turnaround into that new chord like that. And then we can do the exact same thing for that major chord where, okay, we added in this D major here to get back to the A major. Let's go like a 5th below there, add that chord in to get back, right? So let's see what that sounds like when I add 2 of those new chords in, right? So we got So again, that sounds so much more interesting than just kind of running through. And again, you can add both of those together now. So if you wanted to like vary your chord progression and kind of add some variation into your songs, instead of just playing the same loop over and over, you can kind of maybe at the end of 4 bars do that little turnaround where you go like that kind of stuff over there. These are more options to kind of flow and go into your chords rather than just playing the same boring loop over and over. So now that we see that moving chords around in 4ths and 5ths is somewhat of a cheat code to finding chords in outside keys, we can take this concept a tiny bit further and start moving like clusters of chord progressions around in different intervals. So to do this, we need to think about this. We need to have like a chord in mind that is going to be our home base. We're always going to return to it, and then we're going to kind of move a load of chords around it. So for this example, I quite like E major. I'm just going to use the chord of E major as the home base. So we're always going to be landing and returning back to E major. Now I quite like playing these chords to get back to E major, right? So this is G major, D major, then A major, and then into E major. So I quite like this kind of movement here, which gets us nicely back to our home point. Now this movement that I liked, we can actually move that kind of grouping of chords around in intervals too. So instead of like playing it here, what if I moved everything down 2 frets? So I get like, instead of going, I could go and then back into E major. So that gives me like 2 different variations of my chord progression now. So I can go like, and then let's play the next variation. So now we've got like kind of 2 ways to go back to the same chord by kind of just shifting that grouping around in intervals. Now, again, instead of just going down 2 frets, what if I went down 3 frets? So that would give me like E major, and then I play E major again like this position, and then B major, and then F sharp major, which leads really nicely back into this opening here. So again, I could go like, and you can hear that sounds completely different from just going, or now this. Again, it sounds different. It adds some nice kind of variation and different directions to our chord progression. Now, what's fun here is that we can combine all of those movements together to get a quite large, elaborate, and intricate sounding chord progression. So I could do this. I could go like E major, turn back to that home base of E major. Now, the thing is, you can level up things even further if you can figure out how to improvise through these chord changes. It's going to be really satisfying if you can create some nice, intriguing sounding chord progressions and then figure out how to rip a solo over the top of that. You're going to feel like a musical genius no matter what kind of skill level you're at on the instrument. Well, conveniently for you, I've already made a video on this exact subject. So if you want to learn how to improvise through chord changes with the most comfortable scale that we're all familiar with on the guitar, the pentatonic scale, you're going to want to check out this video I've made for you over here. It teaches you how to kind of go through different chord changes from different keys only using pentatonics.